3-goal game now with just over a minute. Here's a deep look. That one tipped up, and it will go to the end zone. It's a turn. Wow, Tyler Chan getting Greg Martin. That is a great play from Tyler Chan.
Chan getting a good few feet in the air with that. What an unbelievable bounce.
It is tough to get Greg Martin in the end zone.
Welcome back. It's Swing Pass. 11 games lined up for Week 11. How about that? I'm Adam Ruffner, that's Daniel Cohen, and we're here to break down a handful of the best action as we get set for the final 3 weekends of the 2023 regular season. We'll be talking about, in particular, matchups in the East and Central divisions concerning some very prominent playoff positioning in both of those divisions. We're going to get right into it, starting with the Boston-Philly matchup on Friday night. These two teams already met once this season. Boston coming away with the win at home. However, the Phoenix were up by 7 goals at a point in that game. The Glory rallying all the way back for the big win in the beginning part of this season. Now, Philly, completely different team, right? Phoenix riding a 5-game winning streak, including a win over Carolina, as well as some very impressive victories against the Canadian teams. Their offense is firing on all cylinders. Their defense looks like one of the best matchup schemes in the entire league. Daniel, what are you looking forward to in this Friday night fiesta in the East Division, ostensibly for the third and final playoff spot in the East?
I think this could be a very grindy defensive battle. We've seen a lot of up and downness from both these teams' offenses, and I think Philly in particular started the year at they were converting between 20 and 30% offensively for those first chunk of games. And obviously they've gotten better since then, but really both these teams, the most consistent, the most defining piece has been their D-lines. And it's been really interesting to see Philly really come into their own and solidify their defensive identity as the season's gone on. They're getting so many contributions from all of their role players. You just name any handful of those D-line players, and they're going to get 1 to 2 blocks each, it seems, pretty much every game. So it's that, and then the ability to convert off of turnovers. I think with Boston, the trajectory we've seen from them just over the years, they've gone from this very offensive-based team where it's been Ben Sadok and Orion Cable and Tanner Halkyard, but this year it's kind of all shifted to that defense and Rocco Linehan, Chris Bartoli. So a lot of defensive energy, I think, is going to be brought to this game on both sides, and I'm just excited to see how that shakes out and then which team can take better advantage of their break opportunities that they're able to get.
Yeah, both teams lately have been able to put up double-digit break scores in some of their wins. I really think it's going to come down to which D-line can find those pressure points in the opposing attack and where they can sort of insist on their style of play. I actually think that both defenses play similar styles. They very much prefer matchup. They're not really into a whole bunch of roller pulls or any kind of fancy setup as we see in other divisions, particularly in the Central and the West. I feel like a bunch of those teams really institute kind of dead disc scenarios to get offenses out of rhythm right away. That is not the case with Boston and Philly. They're both teams very confident in their athleticism and what their defenders can do in one-on-one coverage. And I feel like you're really going to see that in this matchup. And I really feel like it's going to accentuate some really interesting possible 1v1s, right? I think Philly's offense obviously has some of the most dynamic playmakers in James Pollard, CJ Colicchio, Sean Mott, Greg Martin. Jordan Ryan, after starting slow this season, has really started to come on light. He's been a huge part of that fire, fueling the win streak. Calvin Trissolini continues to play great ultimate in the second half of his rookie season. Sort of similar to what you were talking about the Philly D-line, it just feels like each of these Phoenix offensive pieces can contribute in their own way. And yet, Boston all of a sudden has some pretty interesting defenders. And like you were saying, this is not necessarily a storyline that's been prevalent with the Glory the past 2 seasons. They've had talent, certainly on that side of the disc, but not always the kind of ambition, I guess is what I'm looking for to say here.
Yeah.
The little bit of softness. Fair. But this year, that is not the case. And I really have to applaud the kind of team leadership that both Chris Bartoli and Gus Haflin have really kind of institute on this team. Also veterans, Tyler Chan and Jay Clark have stepped up huge for this team, and they've been present. They will be in the starting lineup tomorrow night as well. And I just feel like between those four, as well as the presence of first-year Glory player Rocco Linehan, there's just a lot to work with, both in terms of what they can do in coverage and a lot of what they can do in the counterattack. And I think that's why you're seeing the Glory have so much effectiveness punching in these breaks. You have Tyler Chan, who can run all these give and go sequences. You have a Gus Haflin who can pull the trigger on some deep balls. You have Bartoli, who's kind of like, I think, the East Division's Dylan DeClercq, where he's just so underrated, not only for his energy in coverage, but then how weaponized he becomes as a receiver on that counterattack. He's so good in transition, and he's skinnier of frame, but as Brian Jones has repeatedly called him on broadcast, he's a giant killer. He could potentially match up against like a Pollard or Greg Martin and give them some fits in coverage. Yeah. Obviously, it's going to be back and forth in those sorts of one-on-ones. No one's really going to, I think, get an edge, but just sort of laying the table of, I think, how many interesting pieces. And then I think it flips over to the other side too, right? Like Philly has all the defenders that you were talking about, the Matt Hannas, the Eric Whitmers, the Paul Owens, the Kainua Chunmoys, the Gavin Abrahamsons. Like they just kind of get this whole team effort from their D-line that really hasn't been a staple of Phoenix teams historically, right? Like even before they've kind of re-solidified themselves under the current coaching staff of Glass and Chu the past 2 years, Phoenix were always known as kind of a Sean Mott-styled fast break, up-tempo offense and not much to do on defense. That is not the case this year, and it just feels like that's going to be a really interesting matchup against a Boston offense that is rolling more and more into rhythm. We've talked about a little bit, like they've been missing some of what we might call their biggest offensive playmakers in Orion Cable. Tanner Halkyard is continuing to work back from injury after missing all of last season. He's been in and out of the lineup and just looking, I think, to establish himself to where he was in that 2021 season when he made the all-rookie team and looked downright dominant in that kind of 1-2 game with Ben Sadok. You know, again, this is all to say that like Boston has sort of evolved past that like huck and hope to their bigs that they employed so much in their first 2 seasons. And now it's much more of this very dynamic kind of attack. They can attack you through small ball possession. You know, Kalen McSweeney and Cole Davis Brandt are basically mime versions of each other, or mimics of each other. It's hard to differentiate them.
They look the same on the field.
They're both very upright with the disc when they kind of stand in their stature posture. They both like a kind of, I think, give and go as their base formula.
Yeah, they're very like
to distribute, but they can engage the long ball. I like them a lot. Like I really like the engine that they've formed for this team. And off of that, you get Ben Sadok being more versatile on upfield, kind of being this fluid facilitator between the backfield and the connecting pieces upfield. And then you have, I think, one of the most, I want to say like problematic, because I think that Boston has had really good receiving cores, but this newer one of Tetro, Carapella, who am I missing here? I feel like I'm missing somebody.
Halkyard fits in there.
Halkyard,
Cooper Davis.
Harwood's been coming on of late. Like Harwood has been great in his spot starts on offense. Like there's a little bit more, they feel almost like Austin in a way, like how they're currently employing their attack. They kind of have 5-6 throwers on a lineup at any given time, and they can just sort of attack from anywhere in the field. And I feel like that sort of positioning has benefited them so much during their current kind of surge here.
Yeah, I think it's taken the pressure off of those handlers, whereas like last year and the year before, I feel like it was just Sadok and Davis Brand just needing to do everything for the offense and oftentimes just hucking it into the deep space to Orion Cable when he was available, but he only played like a handful of games, so it really just, the shots did not seem super calculated. But yeah, I think there's a lot more discipline like throughout the line because you have these like more developed throwers kind of all over the field at this point. I'm curious what, like when it comes to these defenses and then shutting down the opposing offenses, which of the two teams, Boston or Philly, do you think their offense is like more likely to be able to respond to the opposing defense if like they do get in a rut? Like which one do you feel like is more adaptable in whatever the other team is shutting down of theirs.
I want to say Philly because I feel like their core has been more consistent over the past 2 seasons.
Yeah,
and I
we've
feel
seen
like
that
I
more.
have a bit of recency bias with my evaluation of Boston right now after they played so well last weekend and had a
Good
franchise
Toronto
low
game.
8 turnovers. Like
Yeah,
I'm all of a sudden like, man, this Ray Tetro led attack could really push Boston into the playoffs. So I need to like tamp that down just a little bit. Everyone
for
gets
sure.
really good offensive looks in that varsity stadium in Toronto. The Rush surrender more hucks per game to their opponents than any other team in the league. And so it stands to benefit a Boston team that likes to kind of look deep naturally and has the kind of speed to go downfield and go get. So I want to temper there. I think Philly has the most bread and butter because of the throwers that they have, right? I mean, I think when you talk about at the end of the day, where are these teams coming from? For Philly, it's Sean Mott, Alex Thorne, Calvin Trissolini, who continues to cut down on his mistakes after experiencing some at the beginning of his rookie season. I just like that base a little bit more than what Boston has. I think in terms of talent, they're almost eye to eye identical. It's just I need a little bit more game data to see exactly how Glory deals with adversity. Because again, like Toronto wasn't going to supply that for them last week. So how are they going to respond to getting stood up a couple times by a very stout Phoenix defense who can challenge you in one-on-one matchups? Again, I think these teams are so similar, and that's kind of why you saw the dramatics in their first matchup, where one team takes this kind of almost obscene lead that doesn't really make sense for how these rivals play, and then all of a sudden it's just ratcheting back the other way and Glory kind of sweeping into this incredible win. Like that sort of percussive nature to the gap that formed feels very representative of like these teams should play close. Like if one team gets any kind of lead, I would be suspect of it. I would expect the other team to respond in a way. Like I don't really see this as much of a game or run so much as like you're saying a little bit of a rock fighter, as I always like to call it, Big Ten football, right? Ground game. Maybe need to establish the ground game.
which is really funny because remember was it last year?
I just want to make I just want to make one last point, and that's that the ground game point is kind of to the point of why I might choose Philly in this scenario. They've shown more of an ability to go back to that possession-based drive and attack than I think Boston has. Going back to their big win against the Flyers, that was how the Phoenix kind of closed out that game offensively. They weren't just shooting deep and employing the long ball. They were very much orchestrating these full field drives and using all 7 players on their offensive unit. And I just really like their ability to implement that kind of ground game. I think that that's going to be really key in this matchup.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think I favor Philly slightly on offense, and I also favor them defensively too. Like I have more faith in Philly to make plays down the stretch, like we saw in that Carolina game too. Like that was also their defense just closing the door on a very talented Flyers team. So I guess I haven't quite seen that from Boston and their defense. So I'd give Philly the edge there. But no, I was just going to mention, was it last year's week 1 that Philly and Boston played that, like, it was a 1-goal game and Boston
25,
was just doing
24, Jordan Ryan had like 7 hucks.
Yeah, everyone, it was just
the team.
Pure offensive shootout, no defense at all. Just
Ryan Cable had like 8 goals.
Yeah. But it's just funny, like how far we've come that now we're predicting like the exact opposite type of game. But I think these teams have very much established new identities this year, so it's been cool to see the transition.
I do think it bears mentioning, and we'll move on after this, but like I think I hear both of us saying hypothetically in our heads we're kind of favoring Philly, and yet we have to bring up the fact that Boston already won this matchup, right? Like they have the edge. I think, and you see how these players are kind of approaching this matchup. Glory has all the confidence. Like as good as Philly has looked riding this 5-game winning streak, like Boston still says at the end of each day, hey, we beat you the last time, and we have a stronger lineup now. We have more confidence. And I think that both teams are going to be very interested in kind of showing themselves as far as like, hey, you don't know how we're playing right now. Like I think Philly kind of has taken the mantle of that outside of just the East Division, but overall in the AUDL, right? It's been pretty apparent from their social media posts that they just kind of think of themselves as the true kind of Dark Lord Prince.
Yeah,
But
I think they.
I think, watch out for Boston still. They started 3-0. They had that terrible weather game against New York that shortened everything. And I think that kind of disrupted a little bit of their early season mojo, to be fair.
Mhm.
And I think that this Glory defense still has something to say. You were talking about having that confidence in Philly's defense, and I think that's absolutely deserved. But just again, to their credit, like Boston's defense was the one that made the win possible in the first matchup between these two teams. It was the Glory
Definitely.
break train that
Yeah.
got rolling and just rolled Philly up under it. And I
Right.
do think that Tyler Chan, Rocco Linehan, and this young, energetic defense can maybe, punch back a bit.
I expect them to. I think this game. Let's make a score prediction. I'm gonna say Philly comes away with like a 19-18 win. I do
I
think
was
it's gonna
gonna
be a 1-goal game.
I was gonna go 18-17, and it's a toss.
18-17.
I want to push. I want to call the score, but push in a decision because I need to see with my eyeballs. I feel like I'm always doing that when I'm pushed to make a decision. I'm like you with picking teams in these. I hedge so much. I don't want to pick.
We
a
love
team.
all the teams. That's our problem. We're just fans of the sport, of the league. Can't
It's
pick
true.
favorites.
It's actually true. That is actually true. Like I am very excited for this Boston Philly
We just
matchup,
like
and
good
that is
games.
not something I necessarily expected to say even
Right.
a few weeks ago. Like I think that these two teams are really peaking in interesting ways with just 3 weekends remaining.
Yeah.
But let's move on to Boston's second game of the weekend because they will have that big test on Friday night, and then they have to go on the road the next night and face the 6-3 DC Breeze, looking for revenge after they lost their battle in New York last Friday. That will be the game of the week on Saturday night on watch.audl.tv. The Breeze look like one of the 2 to 3 best teams in the league this year, right? Like 2 of their 3 losses are to New York. So you can almost just wipe those as far as like a real dampening on what this team is. And their other loss is to the Flyers, who is another championship caliber team, and they lost by a single goal.
Sure.
So I think there is no question as to where this DC team stands as far as its true talent and abilities. However, I'm bringing my biggest Stephen A. Smith. However, they do have 3 losses. If Boston does win on Friday night and comes in with some momentum on Saturday, and DC has some of the offensive rhythm issues that we've seen them prone to, is there a scenario where DC comes away from this weekend and has 4 losses and is suddenly finding themselves not solidly in second place in the East, which is where they've grown kind of comfortably uncomfortable behind New York the past several seasons, but instead they're fighting for their lives in the 3rd seed with Boston, Philly, etc. And potentially Toronto, who is still kind of lurking in the background if they get a win against Detroit and their super soft schedule continues to elevate them back into the playoff picture. Like, I'm just saying it's sort of what we were talking about the other week with Colorado, where it's the losses don't indicate, I think, any dampening again of like where we view these teams as contenders, but it does complicate their playoff positioning and potentially hosting a home game. Now, Colorado acquitted themselves. They're 8-3. They look set to wrap up that 2nd seed, all but like with that New York game, I think. But, DC still has a little bit of work to do. And this Boston team, again, is forming into a bit of an interesting contender. Do you think the Breeze just put them down? I kind of expect that. But again, like this hasn't been a Breeze team that necessarily always separates itself. That even against Montreal the other week when they closed out 8-1, that was a 2-goal game at the end of the 3rd. Like Royale had some momentum. Like DC's defense showed up in the 4th, but like I just wonder how many times DC can continue to sort of evade their own foibles, so to speak. Because again, they're so immensely talented. Like they're so good. There's no denying what DC is.
Yeah, I don't know. DC, they've had a weird year, right? Like they just haven't clicked the way we thought they would have, especially by now. Like these are the last few weeks of the season.
I think we should slow down there. They have, though. Like all of their additions have been fantastic. Like Thomas Edwards, great. Andrew Roy has become the main pivot cog in their offense. Cole Jurek, when he hasn't been hurt, looked amazing for this offense. Their defensive additions have stepped up across the line. Ben Ort has been one of their biggest playmakers. Like, I think I'm just trying to say, like, I think it's confusing because if you go player by player, there's not really anyone having a bad year per se.
I think the ceiling just isn't where we thought it'd be, right? Like I don't think they look like, I don't know. We might have said before the season that they were like maybe a clear number 2 team in the league after New York. Now I would say, it's obviously Carolina is always going to be in the picture. Salt Lake has looked fantastic. So like, I think you had DC power ranked 5 this week. So like, yes, they're still a top 5 team.
My champ picks. Like, I picked them as champions way back last November.
Sure, but I mean, if you set the bar for them that high, I don't think they've looked like a championship team this year. I would not pick them to win the championship right now in the way that they've looked so far. And maybe it's that their O-line has looked good at times. Their D-line has looked great at times. Maybe they just haven't put it all together in the same weeks. Like, even in recent weeks, even with the Edmonds switch to D-line, they're still only converting like between like 40 and 50% of their D-line break opportunities. And you expect a team like DC to be higher than that with the amount of talent that they have throughout that roster and the amount of offensive players that are like playing D-line for them. You just expect them to be a little bit more efficient. And I just don't think we've seen them live up to that so far this year. It's not to say they're bad. Obviously, them not living up to their expectations still makes for a top 5 team. But there's like, I guess just when you talk about them in the context of like the champion conversation for the 2023 season, I haven't seen that for them this year.
I hear you. And yet, as you're talking, my mind is going back to that week 3 game that went to overtime in the first matchup against New York. And I think, what if Ben Yacht doesn't come down with that crazy catch and double coverage in overtime? What if DC scores and they win that game? Like, how much does that single goal reverse how we think of this DC team? Because I think it's a lot. Like, I really think, like, they get that one win over the Empire, and let's say it's exactly the same otherwise. Like, let's say they dropped last weekend against New York the same way, and they still lose to Carolina, but they're 7-3. Does that version of DC become a championship contender in your eyes? Does that, like, single result flip change? Like, let's again say that, like, every other point in that game is basically the same. Like, DC has the same sorts of flaws and everything else, but they just simply get one lucky break in one of these matchups against the Empire, and Yacht doesn't come down. One of the Empire stars doesn't come down with the most defining play of the entire freaking game. Like, let's just say that happens one time for DC. Like, does that change?
It changes things. It changes things a little bit, but the problem is that it's the reason why I'm always going to have them behind New York is because New York does make plays like that in the fourth quarter in overtime. Like, that's what they do, and that's what the best teams do. And like, I guess DC was able to close out that week 1 win against Carolina, but that was like against a weird Carolina roster. I just don't know that we've seen
that required a fourth quarter close too. They had to go on like a 6-1 run in order to pull away in that one. It felt kind of like the Montreal game where they had that wooziness. Yeah. And that was kind of more when they were integrating all of these new pieces, right? Like, there was more of an understandable nature around, like, oh, they're going to experience some arrhythmia here. Like, that makes total sense for all these new additions.
Yeah, but that game was like, kind of a weird, like, inconsistent game from both teams for most of the game. Rather than with the New York game, it's like, it's cleanliness throughout the game, and then it's like, who wants it more at the end? And it's like always New York. So anyway, all this to say, let's get back to DC and Boston. I would say Boston has maybe like a 5% chance of beating DC this week. Like, I fully expect DC to win by at least like 4 goals. And they have played some weird recent games against Boston where their efficiency is down and they're up like 20 plus turnovers, but second game of a back-to-back for Boston after playing Philly, and we expect that game, like we established, to be super close, super back and forth. I just don't think Boston has the depth or energy to match a DC team playing at home, a fresh DC team.
Yeah, and rebounding off of a New York game, I feel like I need to go back and see like what has happened, because New York has now won 9 out of the last 10 meetings. I need to go see what the following opponent experienced after DC, because I feel like they're one of the best teams at sort of taking out those frustrations on the next susceptible
and I
opponent.
want
And
that. I want that for them. They need a game like that, in my opinion. Like, especially as we're in the final weeks of the season, they need like one of the old DC Boston games where they won 30-20 or whatever. Like, they need one of those again where it's just like hyper efficiency on both sides of the disc. Like, Boston never has a chance. I think that'd be good for the Breeze. Personally.
I agree with you. And again, like, my mind and my memory is like betraying me, because now all of a sudden I'm thinking about kind of the beginning of this current era of Empire dominance and the end of the 2018 regular season. It was Christian Boxley's rookie year. He went off in the final regular season meeting against Empire, had like 7 goals. It was Rowan MVP performance type of game. I think they won by like 9 or 10 in the game of the week in the final regular season weekend. And then they played New York in the opening round of the playoffs that year. And it was the torrential downpour game where neither team scored in the fourth quarter, and the Empire won and went on to face Toronto and finally got off the mend against the Rush in the playoffs, got their first ever victory against Toronto. Like, that is now 5 years ago, and yet it feels more recent because there's still so many pieces on both New York and DC that are so similar. So I don't know. Like, I agree with you. I think Breeze need a convincing win. I'm just reflecting on the history of, man, they got that one year, and that like ignited the current Empire dynasty. Like, that didn't go so well. So I don't know. I agree though. Breeze could really benefit from a convincing win against an opponent the caliber of Boston. Because again, Boston is good right now. Like, they're feisty. And especially if they get another win against the league's hottest team from Philly, you know, if you believe the Philly social media hype. We'll actually get to one of the hottest teams with the 3rd longest winning streak in the league right now, in Indy, who's on a 7-game heater. Philly, of course, very deserving in their 5-game heater. We'll see if they can extend it tomorrow night in that big battle on AUDL TV with Boston. Want to continue to move on. We're going to get to the Central Division now. We're going to start by talking about, well, both of these are actually doubleheaders, but we're only going to be talking about 3 games in there. We'll start with one of the more interesting ones. Actually, both are really intriguing. So Chicago and Pittsburgh will be playing a doubleheader set against each other, first on Friday in Pittsburgh, and then on Saturday in Chicago. There's rumor that they're going to be sharing buses possibly, or modes of transport, which would just be like super interesting. And I need some kind of 30 for 30 doc about, especially
someone's got to document the entire bus ride. Like, they just want their media person.
I know this is probably a little mean. I want like one player from the losing team on Friday to be in like a van full of the other team on Saturday, just like lone wolfing it in like enemy territory and just having to like build up. Like, I don't know. Anyways, 5-3 Chicago, 4-4 Pittsburgh. These are the 2 teams fighting for the 3rd seed in the Central Division. They haven't played yet this year. They are 2 teams who historically play very close against each other, as most of the teams in the Central do, from sheer familiarity over the many, many seasons that they've been competing in. I think these games boil down to 2 pretty simple questions. One is, how the hell is Chicago going to slow down Max Shepard, who is on a freaking tear right now, the likes of which we haven't seen since he went supernova in the second half of the 2019 season following his All-Star Game MVP. He's reached those similar heights right now. Granted, it's been against some of the league's worst defenses, but nonetheless, Shepard is shooting. He's got back-to-back games with 450 throwing yards. He's got 16 assists in his last 2 games. We talk about video game numbers. Go look at Max Shepard's stat page from the last 3 games and tell me those aren't user-controlled numbers. He's just been otherworldly, quite frankly. And if you go look at the film, it's from everywhere, right? He's bombing 70-yard backhands, forehands from a standstill. He's being the most active cutter. He's developing way more patience for where he institutes all of his skills, right? There isn't kind of the hecticness that I think we've seen in previous seasons with Shepard. There's this kind of laser precision now when he wants to go deep as a thrower. He knows which targets he's going to, which has mainly been Carl Johnson, who has been a really big boon for this Thunderbirds offense. And then as a receiver, frankly, there's not anyone who can match his foot speed in one-on-one coverage in the Central Division. And I think that that's going to be Chicago's biggest worry, right? Is just simply figuring out how to slow down Shepard from just running around and getting whatever he wants. Because that's what he's been doing for a few weeks. And we know what happens when Max Shepard gets this full steam of confidence. He turns into Mad Max, and he can basically do whatever he wants on a Frisbee field. We saw it last fall in the All-Star game. We're seeing it now in this month of July. Like, Chicago has a good defense. I think they run good systems. I'm worried that Shepard and this Thunderbirds offense is going to roll right over him. You know, this Chicago team is very efficient in converting the break opportunities that they do get, but they're not great at generating them like they have been the past couple of seasons. They're not super stout in coverage. I mean, in one of their last games against Detroit, they had struggles in the second half slowing down that Mechanix offense. It stands to reason that Pittsburgh has a lot more weapons on it than Detroit does right now. And I worry a little bit about that for the Union.
Yeah, it's interesting. And by the way, I was just looking at Max Shepard's stats for this season. He's only played 8 games. The past 2 years, he's played 12 in both seasons. He already has more throwing yards than each of the past 2 seasons. He's completed 28 hucks. He was 21 and 24 the prior 2 seasons. Like, I mean, you watch him play, and he's just clearly launching the disc, like you said, from literally any spot on the field. I feel like he loves like the sideline to sideline cross field hucks, both backhand and flick side. I don't know that there's a solution. We're not the coaches of Chicago. We're not going to tell Chicago how they can slow down Max Shepard. But I do think they're a well-coached team, and like I think this defense has been probably better than we thought it'd be coming into the season. Like, they still are getting a lot of production from like role player types and guys kind of expanding into bigger roles like Asher Lance, Jace Bruner. So I have confidence in Chicago that they will do enough to slow down this Thunderbirds offense, because I think the Thunderbirds offense is kind of volatile at times. Like, obviously they're taking a lot of shots pretty consistently. I don't know where they rank in terms of offensive efficiency, but I don't think it's that high. It's probably bottom half of the league if I had to guess. And I just don't think they play a clean enough offensive game to limit the amount of break chances that Chicago is going to have against them. And I definitely favor the Chicago D-line converting breaks over the Pittsburgh D-line, but the Chicago offense is another problem. Like, that has just not looked good really at any point this year. I think they had one game, maybe 1 or 2 games where they've been over 50% converting their offensive possessions, and it came against Detroit 2 weeks ago. What was interesting is they moved Ben Priest and Jake Steslicki over to offense for those 2 games. And so I'm curious to see if that rotation sticks. They have a pretty similar roster that they're taking to Pittsburgh and hosting Pittsburgh with this weekend. But like, I think Paul Arders is probably not going to play. Shanahan is back in the lineup. Kaminsky is back in the lineup. But yeah, they just haven't like found a recipe for the efficient offense that we've seen the past couple of years. And obviously the Pavlianis-sized hole in the offense still looms. So I'm still kind of waiting for the Chicago offense to hit its stride. I think both these teams have an opportunity to make a statement and really propel themselves into the playoff race with these 2 games.
Should be noted, Max Shepard has been on fire. Andrew Sjogren, the former Mechanix player, now in his first season with the Union, he was fantastic against the Pittsburgh defense last year. I'm sure the Union will be looking to get him his touches on Friday and Saturday night. I agree with you. I think that if Chicago can find more stability by swapping Priest and Steslicki over to the offense, they've looked like the best pairing on their team all season. There is no flash. I think they might have 1 combined huck between them. 1. Otherwise, it's just literal give and goes like the entire time. Like, all they want to do is complete really tight chest level passes between 10 and 15 yards. And I love that for them. I love the way in which it's sort of, I think, put in relief the struggles elsewhere with the Chicago attack, which ranges, right? Like, they just don't have an identity without Giannis anymore. They have talent, and there are times when you see particular drives where it makes sense, but on a quarter-to-quarter basis, they are one of the most inconsistent offenses in the entire league, and that's been visible all year. And so I guess my worry is that if Shepard gets in the rhythm, does Chicago have the firepower, right now to keep up with Pittsburgh if they score 20 plus? Like, I think if you're the Union, you're very much pushing for a classic 18-15 Central Division struggle or something, because I think if you
Yes.
turn this into a track meet, the more and more it favors a Thunderbirds team that's looking to institute that. Again,
I'd agree
Shepard,
with that.
Carl Johnson, Jimmy Toll has been playing great. Jonathan Mass returning to this team has just been so important to, I think, giving them a baseline of throwing and distribution skills on offense, and has really allowed Shepard to unload more of those volume touches and instead refined him into the score sensation that we're seeing this season that's averaging almost 8 scores a game and leads the entire league, right? Like,
Yeah. I'm kind of wondering also, I mean, it might be weather dependent too, but I wonder if on Friday night we get like a higher scoring shootout type game, and then when they come to Chicago on Saturday that everything like condenses back and it's a lot lower scoring just because of fatigue, or maybe the weather in Chicago is potentially windier overall. But yeah, I'm curious, like, do you think there will be any discernible differences in these two games, and like who do you think it would favor in each scenario?
yeah, I think Pittsburgh's home field does have a little bit more of offensive favorable variables. It just feels like teams get out pretty comfortably into open spaces, and especially in Huck looks at that field.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, something about that De La Salle Stadium that Chicago plays at, there's a bit of a wind tunnel. I mean, it is the Windy
It's
City
kinda
of
gusty.
Chicago. And by the way, though, the Windy City refers to politicians, not necessarily atmospheric conditions. I have to say that.
Always good to note.
I'm technically a Chicago native, born in Cook County Hospital, so I gotta just say that. But anyways, there's always a wind at De La Salle Field that seems to push one direction that just makes scoring at times a bit of a battle of attrition. And you just see that, I think, with how the Union have won games through these kind of low scoring defensive edge, break battles. I totally agree with you. I could see Friday night being high scoring and Saturday night slowing down a lot. But we need to continue to move a pace. So let's talk about the final doubleheader of the weekend, talking a little bit about Friday night, but mostly about Sunday. And that is the Minnesota Wind Chill sitting at 6-2, now coming off of a bye week following their big 25-15 loss in Colorado almost 14 days ago now. Wind Chill really looking to rebound after that, and especially considering that Indy has usurped first place from them in the Central Division, as the AlleyCats are riding a 7-game winning streak right now. They look to be one of the hottest teams in the league, and I know everyone is really, really eager to put a kind of damper on Indy's success. They play indoors, it's the Central Division, et cetera, et cetera. I'm here to tell you, you watch this team game in, game out. You might not like certain things. You might say, hey, their ceiling isn't as high as these other teams. As far as just execution and running what the team has put into place as their systems, there are not 4 better teams in the league right now than Indy. I'm not saying that they're going to win a championship. I'm not even necessarily saying that they're going to win the Central, but they're very impressive in what they do, and you cannot deny them that anymore, right? Like, this is a team now that has led the league 2 straight years running in defensive line efficiency rate. That is like as gold of a star metric as we have as far as like team evals. I feel like it almost attenuates exactly to like playoff prediction and performance. The number one being offensive line efficiency, which has predicted the last, I think, 3 champions or even more.
Something like that.
Each of the last 3 or 4
they're always
or 5
up there.
AUDL champions have finished first place in offensive efficiency. Anyways, Indy's up there as well too. They lead the league in fewest turnovers per game this season. Like, you start to look at the resume of Indy, and yes, they might lack quality wins and some other stuff, but they are continuing to win the games that they need to. They are playing in the ways that they did. They just got their biggest win ever against their most fierce rival from Madison. And as I wrote about in the power rankings, have just completely reversed that rivalry. And again, it wasn't that long ago that Indy never won against Madison. This is the AlleyCats team that took until 2018 and basically 2 to 3 games a year in order to get their first victory against the Madison franchise. I digress. I've gotten way off onto a tangent. Minnesota will be playing in Madison on Friday night to begin their quirky doubleheader. They are 6-2. They will need to win that game because on Sunday they will be hosting the 7-2 Indy AlleyCats in what will effectively determine who takes the first place regular season title in the Central Division and an all-important home game in the playoffs. What do you make of this Minnesota team right now, Daniel? I think that, 3 weeks ago we were coming off of that performance in Madison when they looked like they had figured out the secret code of the new pulling rules. Their defense was blitzing down and just giving Madison's offense fits. And then they have that game in Colorado, and it just sort of, says like, what were the blinders that I had on? What were the kind of almost drunk goggles or something that I had this Windshield team when they just looked completely lost from like basically the opening pull. They've now had 2 weeks to sort of reconcile all that, possibly move on, possibly learn their mistakes. Do you think this is a good point for the Windshield to have their worst loss of the season? Because it's felt like the past 2 years it came in the playoffs against Chicago. So maybe now they got a little bit out of their system. I don't know. I still like this Minnesota team, but all of a sudden now it's the fear that I get every season, which is that they have the capability of losing games really badly. And that's not something that we say of like Carolina.
We haven't seen a loss that bad, though. We haven't seen like a 10-goal loss from Minnesota in years, probably. Like that was.
But I would say the 2021 playoff collapse is darn near it. I know it's not
sure. That was a bad loss.
Giving up 5 straight goals to lose the divisional title game, that'll hurt you for a few years. Like,
the stinger. I don't know. It's really hard to know what to make of the Colorado game in particular. Maybe we chalk it up to divisional skill level differences this year, and that the West is probably just better than the Central as a whole. We knew this would be a down year for the Central. Of course, you never fully understand how much of a down year it is until we get those out of division games. I'm kind of tempted to go that route and still think of Minnesota as a top team in the Central Division, but I do think mentally, just like how you respond to a loss like that is going to be very telling. If they go to Madison and lose after like how dominant they looked in Madison just a few weeks earlier, that's going to be really troubling for this Minnesota team. And I think in that situation,
they did that last season. They had that impressive Week 5 win in Madison, and then they had a second matchup later in the year, and it kind of derailed their confidence a bit. It was the Radicals' last gasp to getting to 500 for the year in the win-loss column, and it just you could see it was this like chink in the armor sort of thing where Windshield looked like the odds-on favorites to challenge Chicago, and that's like, but Madison can still defeat you, and Chicago's not losing to Madison.
And what's tough is that, Madison's 1-7, but I still think they have it in them to beat Minnesota at home. Like, I still don't think of this Madison team as bad necessarily. This is not going to be an easy win for Minnesota by any means. But I do think it's an opportunity. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Madison's in kitchen sink mode. Like, their season is over. All they're looking for is to be a monkey wrench in whatever opponent that they face in the coming weeks.
Yeah, well, and you feel like they're kind of due for another win, right? Like, it's weird how many close games they've played to this point, and they've only won one of them.
I gave up on the due idea at least.
They were due weeks ago. They're overdue. They're overdue at this point. Anyway, I think it's obviously an opportunity for Madison to throw a wrench in Minnesota's playoff plans, but it's also an opportunity for Minnesota to really like show us that they can bounce back from pretty significant adversity a couple weeks back. So I think Minnesota, if they can have a 2-0 weekend, let's just start with the Madison game. If they can beat Madison, I'm tempted to favor them at home against Indianapolis. Like I know the AlleyCats have been playing really well, but I still think there is something to Minnesota playing at home. They're gonna have Sam Berglund back in the lineup, which I think they're pulling against Colorado is just like kind of an afterthought. Like it never really seemed to make a difference. Maybe that was because they got down so early, so quickly. But yeah, it's like those X Factor type guys do seem to kind of come alive at home oftentimes. And obviously the wind plays into their favor as well. So yeah, I think if they win in Madison, I'd favor them at home against Indy, still only by like a goal or two. But a 2-0 weekend, that would basically clinch the Central Division for them.
Mm-hmm. I think the points for Madison are obviously the return of Sam Berglund. I kind of consider him to be their team MVP this year. I mean, you saw how important he was in that victory in Madison. And just generally, I think the confidence that he gives that D-line, the ability for de Klerk to just essentially just put his head down and start running for the end zone immediately following any kind of turnover or block, like
Yeah.
that stretching ability, that transition pressure that the windshield can apply to opponents has been so instrumental to their victories this year. And especially given that they've dealt with the absence of Abe Coffin for most of the season. That'll be another big piece here. You know, he gets an extra 2 weeks to rest following his first start after his injury. You know, he did not look like the Abe Coffin we know, the All-Star game MVP, you know, like in his first return in that Colorado game. And I expect him to look a lot more at game speed this
Revenge
weekend.
game. Revenge game? Can we get some revenge game credit? Abe Coffin going back to
I mean,
Madison?
what's the term limits on a revenge game? Because he hasn't
It's
played.
It's all encompassing. It's all encompassing. If you were ever if you were even a practice player on another team like 10 years ago, don't care. We're gonna take advantage of our revenge game narratives.
Bad blood persists. All right, I can.
Oh, he's out for Madison.
Minnesota will have their most talented throwing lineup available all season. Like, they have been one of the teams really beset with injuries to their handler rotations, and I feel like they're finally coming out of the woods a little bit there. I think all of that stands to benefit Minnesota. And again, to your point, they play elevated at home. I don't know that I'm willing to give them a total advantage at home, but they seem to understand the swirling conditions of Seafoam Stadium better than anybody, as they should.
I think, hasn't it only been Chicago that's beaten them at home in like the past several seasons? Like, no one else.
I mean, Madison did a few years ago, but it was like when they just started playing there and they were playing half their games there in the Blaine Sports Center. It wasn't like,
so what, maybe like 2018 or 2019 or something?
What I'm thinking of. Yeah. Then that might be one of the last ones. I would have to go back and look, but it feels like Chicago has been really the only team to challenge Minnesota. But to that point, one thing that has stuck with me, and it was interviewing AlleyCats coach Drew Shepard before their game here in Madison a couple weeks ago, and that was him insisting that A, he doesn't like their indoor stadium, and B, him and his players feel like they are built as an outdoor team this year. And I gotta say, just looking at how they play, I gotta agree. Like, I think that we've sometimes talked about Keegan North and those throwers as being very elevated indoors, and then something kind of happens when they go outdoors. I think that Xavier Payne's switch over to offense and them getting an additional arm talent of that level has pushed the confidence and just the growth of all of their throwers. Like, I shouldn't just credit it to XP, but like, you know, Rick Gross, Travis Carpenter, Cam Brock, Jeremy Keish, like all those guys are such better throwers than they were even a season or two ago. And I feel like all of that elevation has just made them a bit of a different beast when you play them away from Grand Park right now. Like, this is a team that is one of the tallest, if not the tallest, in the Central Division. Like, their defense is bigger than a lot of, I think, their opponents want to admit. Those twin tower teams that they have in Wettengale and blanking on number 99's name right now, but they'll deploy them on double team marks sometimes. Like, Fletcher Hare isn't small, Jacob Fella isn't small, Jeff Burris is not small, Seth Gudeman is not small. Like, this Indy team can present some size, and I'm interested to see how Minnesota kind of plays against that. Because the last time it was indoors, it felt like Josh Klain and Quinn Snyder just kind of threw around and over a lot of Indy's defense. I want to see if they can do that as much outdoors. I think Minnesota's defense is still going to get theirs. Like, they prowl the lanes as good as anybody, and that is disruptive to Indy's swing-heavy offense and the amount of extra passes that they like to make. But I want to see this Minnesota offense kind of prove itself again against the AlleyCats defense that has continued to evolve over this season.
I want to bring up one other offensive name that I don't know if you mentioned, but Levi Jacobs. I feel like their offense used to be so much of just like getting him the disc in the middle of the field, and he would just like launch hucks and typically only complete like 90-ish% of his throws. He is having a career year in terms of completion percentage. He's up over 94% this year, and his huck numbers are way, way down. Only 5 completed hucks this year compared to 19 and 16 the previous 2 seasons. Like, that to me sort of is a great example of how this offense has shifted, where like there's not really any weak spots anymore. You're not getting this offense just like throwing turnovers downfield and allowing teams to break them as consistently. And it's why the AlleyCats are leading the league in fewest turnovers per game. They've just gotten like so much more consistent and so much more possession oriented. And that's really worked in their favor. Like even Travis Carpenter has just been like swinging and distributing the disc all season, like not really taking too many shots. That like new identity that they've built for themselves, I think is why they are currently in first place in the Central, right? Like I would say that was a weak point of theirs. And that was when their offense looked weird, as if they were trying to take all those shots deep outdoors that used to work so well indoors, but just weren't connecting. And then the offense could kind of fall out of sorts. You're just not seeing that same aggressiveness, which has really been great for them.
Yeah. Well, and we'll get to see that on Sunday night. Again, Indy will face Minnesota at Seafoam Stadium to wrap up the Week 11 calendar, but there will be 10 other games, 11 in total in Week 11. We've previewed some of them here. We'll recap a few more in just a couple days. We're wrapping up this episode of Swing Pass. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be talking to you soon. Bye now.